Have you ever looked into the eyes of the child you raised for 25 years and wondered if a monster hides behind his warm smile? I thought family was my ultimate sanctuary until one rainy Friday afternoon. A forgotten purse led me back to the restaurant. The manager locked the security room door, his face pale, and hit play. My heart shattered, replaced by something colder than death. Stay until the very end, because the truth is incredibly sick. Hello, and welcome back to James Revenge Stories. Before we dive into today's tale, I want to speak to you directly with a sincere request. YouTube has recently disabled our channel's monetization features, leaving us completely without an operating budget. If you find yourself captivated by today's story, please consider supporting us with a donation of just $1. This small contribution helps us pay our dedicated staff so they can afford their daily living expenses and continue crafting these thrilling narratives for you. You can donate easily by scanning the PayPal QR code currently on your screen, or by clicking the PayPal link provided in the video description and the pinned comment below. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. Now let us begin. My name is Neve Pierce. At 45 years old, I had built an empire from the ground up. As the chief executive officer of Axiom Dynamics, one of the most powerful technology conglomerates in the country, my daily life was a relentless chessboard of calculated risks, hostile takeovers, and ruthless negotiations. But in the presence of my 25-year-old son Julian, all my armor stripped away. To him, I was just a mother. It was a rainy Friday afternoon, and we were sharing a quiet lunch at the Obsidian, an exclusive high-end restaurant situated right in the heart of the financial district. The atmosphere was incredibly peaceful, filled with the soft clinking of crystal goblets and the low, polite murmur of wealthy patrons. Julian sat directly across from me, his handsome face lined with what I wholeheartedly believed was genuine affection and concern. "Mom, you look completely exhausted," he murmured softly, reaching across the white linen tablecloth to gently squeeze my hand. "You have been pushing yourself way too hard at the firm lately. You really need to slow down." I offered him a weary, grateful smile. For the past 3 weeks, my life had been a waking nightmare. I had been suffering from agonizing insomnia, sudden bouts of dizzying vertigo, and completely uncharacteristic emotional outbursts that left me feeling entirely out of control. My expensive private physician had confidently diagnosed it as acute executive stress. "It is just an incredibly heavy quarter, Julian," I replied, taking a slow sip of my sparkling water. "The new corporate merger is taking a massive toll on my schedule." "Well, I am absolutely not letting you leave until you at least try to unwind," he insisted with a warm, comforting laugh. He confidently signaled the waiter over to our table. "Please bring my mother your signature herbal relaxation cocktail. She desperately needs something to take the edge off her stress." My heart swelled with an overwhelming sense of maternal pride. Despite my immense wealth and the brutal, demanding nature of my career, I had somehow managed to raise a son who was fiercely thoughtful, deeply caring, and entirely devoted to my well-being. Or so I foolishly thought. I briefly excused myself to use the restroom, touching his shoulder affectionately as I walked by. When I returned, the vibrantly colored cocktail was already waiting for me. I drank it down, genuinely enjoying the soothing botanical taste, and we finished our lovely meal in pleasant, easy conversation. I hugged him goodbye outside under the large restaurant awning and stepped into my sleek, chauffeured car to head back to the Axiom Dynamics headquarters. We were barely 10 minutes into the busy city drive when I casually reached down and realized my adjacent seat was empty. I had left my custom designer purse hanging on the back of my dining chair. "Turn the car around immediately," I firmly instructed my driver. When I walked back into the Obsidian, the heavy lunch rush had already cleared out. I fully expected to simply stride up to my former table, retrieve my expensive bag, and leave. Instead, Marcus, the seasoned general manager, who had personally known me for over 10 years, abruptly intercepted me near the grand entrance. He was tightly clutching my purse against his chest, but his face was deathly ashen, completely drained of all color. He looked absolutely terrified. "Marcus, thank you so much," I said pleasantly, reaching out for the bag. I cannot believe I was so ridiculously absent-minded. He did not hand it over. Instead, he gripped my forearm with violently trembling fingers. "Mrs. Pierce, I urgently need you to come with me to the back office right now. Please." I frowned instantly, my sharp executive instincts flaring angrily at his highly unprofessional tone and physical contact. But the sheer, unadulterated panic radiating from his eyes made me comply without a word. He hurriedly led me through the bustling kitchen and down a narrow, dim hallway into the cramped, windowless security room. The very moment we stepped inside, Marcus shoved the heavy metal door shut and threw the steel deadbolt. "Marcus, what on earth is going on here?" I demanded sharply. He swallowed hard, his voice shaking uncontrollably. "Mrs. Pierce." I was just doing a routine playback of the main floor cameras because one of our servers reported a missing wallet. I happened to glance at your specific table while you were away in the restroom. "Please, ma'am, I am begging you, do not scream." He reached out with a trembling hand and clicked the computer mouse. The large monitor sitting directly in front of us flared to life, displaying the high-definition black and white security feed of my table from exactly 45 minutes ago. I silently watched myself stand up and walk completely out of the frame. Then the digital camera zoomed in closely on Julian. The loving, deeply attentive son I had just shared a beautiful meal with vanished before my very eyes. On the glowing screen, Julian's expression turned utterly cold, vacant, and brutally calculated. He darted his eyes shiftily around the dining room, thoroughly ensuring none of the waitstaff were looking in his direction. Then he swiftly reached into his inner suit jacket pocket and pulled out a small, transparent glass vial. He deftly uncapped it with his thumb, leaned directly over my water glass and my freshly poured herbal cocktail, and casually squeezed several generous drops of a mysterious thick liquid into both of my drinks. He calmly pocketed the vial, picked up his silver fork, and went right back to eating his salad, as if absolutely nothing sinister had just occurred. My entire world violently collapsed. The solid ground beneath my designer heels felt as though it had abruptly opened up into a dark, bottomless abyss. All the breathable air was instantly sucked out of the tiny security room. Suddenly, every single terrifying medical symptom I had experienced over the last grueling month slammed into my conscious mind with crystal devastating clarity. The sudden blinding dizziness in crucial board meetings. The terrifying mild hallucinations when I was working late and alone in my glass office. The uncontrollable, humiliating sobbing fits that made me genuinely feel like I was rapidly losing my sanity. It was not executive stress. It was not physical exhaustion. My own flesh and blood was actively poisoning me. A single tear burning hot and sharply stinging slid slowly down my right cheek. I stared blankly at the frozen digital frame of Julian's indifferent sociopathic face, deeply mourning the agonizing death of the beautiful son I thought I truly knew. The raw grief was suffocating, a literal physical pain violently ripping through the center of my chest. But that pathetic mourning lasted for exactly 10 seconds. I slowly raised my steady hand and forcefully wiped the tear away, completely smearing it into nothingness. The shattered, bleeding pieces of my motherly heart rapidly hardened into solid, unbreakable ice. The desperate, confused, loving mother inside me died right there in that dark security room, and the ruthless, unyielding chief executive officer of Axiom Dynamics fully resurrected in her place. "Did you make a copy of this specific footage?" I asked calmly, my tone terrifyingly flat, completely devoid of the emotional tremor it held just mere moments ago. Marcus nodded frantically, quickly handing me a small silver flash drive. "Yes, ma'am. I immediately put it on here. Should I call the police department?" "No," I whispered coldly, seamlessly slipping the metal drive into my jacket pocket. "You will say absolutely nothing to anyone, Marcus. You will permanently delete the original video file, and you will force yourself to forget you ever saw this today." I swiftly unlocked the heavy door and stepped confidently out of the claustrophobic room. As I boldly walked out of the quiet restaurant and back into the pouring, relentless rain, a cold, incredibly sharp smile slowly crept across my painted lips. There would be no foolish weakness. There would be no hysterical screaming or desperate dramatic family confrontations. My beloved son had arrogantly decided to play a deadly, treacherous game in the shadows. But he had stupidly forgotten one crucial, fatal detail. I was the master who taught him exactly how to play. A brutal survival plan had just been fully activated, and I was going to systematically tear his entire pathetic world apart. Instead of ordering my chauffeur back to the gleaming glass tower of Axiom Dynamics, I directed him to a grim, industrial suburb 30 miles completely outside the city limits. I desperately needed medical answers that could never be traced back to my pristine executive health insurance profile or my corporate medical team. I confidently walked into an independent, privately owned toxicology laboratory situated in a rundown strip mall under the assumed name of Sarah Jenkins. I paid a premium, unrecorded rush fee of exactly $5,000 in cold, untraceable cash. The sterile, biting scent of cheap industrial bleach in the empty waiting room perfectly matched the frozen dead sensation rapidly spreading through my veins. The wait felt like an absolute eternity. 2 agonizing hours later, the chief technician silently slid a thick manila folder across his scratched metallic desk. I opened it. The printed results were glaringly definitive and utterly damning. My bloodstream contained dangerously elevated traces of a highly potent custom-synthesized hallucinogenic narcotic. The technician explained that this specific chemical compound, when administered in calculated micro-doses over an extended period of time, was scientifically designed to artificially induce severe paranoia, acute auditory hallucinations, and a rapid, devastating decline in basic cognitive function. It was quite literally a chemical straitjacket designed to slowly erase my mind without leaving the obvious trauma of a physical assault. I returned to my sprawling, silent estate that evening with a flawless, impenetrable mask securely fastened over my seething rage. The most difficult and demanding performance of my entire life began the very moment Julian walked casually through the massive oak front doors. Over the next 14 days, I played the tragic, pathetic role of a brilliant, powerful woman slowly and visibly deteriorating into madness. I deliberately feigned crippling, blinding migraines during family dinners. I intentionally dropped a delicate crystal wine glass on the hardwood kitchen floor just so I could collapse to my knees and weep uncontrollably over the shattered pieces rocking back and forth like a frightened child. And every single night Julian played the Oscar-worthy role of the deeply devoted, grief-stricken son. He would gently knock on my heavy bedroom door, offering a warm mug of imported chamomile tea or a custom-blended, organic smoothie. "Drink this, Mom. It will really help quiet your racing thoughts and let you sleep," he would coo softly, his tone dripping with thick synthetic sympathy. I would eagerly take the warm porcelain mug with violently trembling hands, thank him profusely through fake pathetic tears, and wait until his soft footsteps faded completely down the long, dark mahogany hallway. Then I would calmly walk into my luxurious master bathroom, lock the door, and pour the toxic sludge straight down the cold marble sink drain. Afterward, I would carefully observe him through the tiny crack in the door frame. I watched his tense posture instantly relax, his fake look of deep concern melting into a chilling, arrogant smirk the moment he firmly believed he was completely unobserved. While Julian arrogantly thought he was successfully destroying my brain and tearing my empire down, I was meticulously tearing his heavily guarded secret life completely apart. I bypassed regular private eyes and retained the expensive services of a ruthless former Federal Intelligence operative turned shadow investigator. I gave this ghost a limitless operational budget and one singular, unbreakable directive: rip open every single hidden aspect of my son's digital and financial existence. The encrypted digital dossier he delivered securely to my burner laptop exactly 4 days later was a staggering, gut-wrenching revelation. Julian was not merely a spoiled, careless heir, living luxuriously off his generous $250,000 annual trust fund allowance. He was drowning in an ocean of blood money. My private investigator uncovered a massive, heavily concealed labyrinth of offshore debts tied directly to a highly violent, ruthless underground sports betting syndicate operating out of the eastern seaboard. My beautiful, Seemingly perfect son owed over $6 million to men who absolutely did not send polite collection notices or negotiate payment plans. They sent brutal physical threats. Julian was utterly desperate, backed into a terrifying, deadly corner with absolutely no way out. But a panicked 25-year-old gambling addict fundamentally lacks the sophisticated corporate intellect and the necessary medical access to execute a hostile, systematic medical takeover of a billion-dollar tech conglomerate entirely on his own. The final sickening piece of the intricate puzzle violently clicked into place when my investigator successfully cracked Julian's heavily encrypted messaging application. The downloaded chat transcripts burned my eyes as I read them in the dark. He was absolutely not acting alone. His brilliant invisible accomplice in this sick game was none other than Dr. Vance, my highly esteemed, ridiculously expensive private psychiatrist. The very man I had trusted implicitly with my deepest, darkest vulnerabilities for over 5 years. The very man who had authoritatively diagnosed me with acute executive stress just 3 weeks prior. I read their extensive digital exchanges with a sickening cold knot violently twisting in the pit of my stomach. Julian was providing the physical poison, and Dr. Vance was meticulously forging the official medical documentation to match my chemically induced symptoms. Together, they were actively and maliciously building a bulletproof, legally binding psychiatric profile designed to explicitly prove to a judge that I was suffering from early-onset dementia accompanied by severe paranoid schizophrenia. Their ultimate objective was breathtakingly malicious and brilliantly simple. Deep within the foundational corporate bylaws of Axiom Dynamics, buried under hundreds of pages of dense legal jargon, was the strict health and moral turpitude clause. If the executive board of directors ever received irrefutable documented medical evidence that the chief executive officer was mentally unfit to lead, they could legally and permanently strip me of my voting rights and force an involuntary transfer of executive power. Julian, acting as my sole legal heir and designated medical proxy, would instantly gain total operational control over my 75% controlling stake in the massive company. The encrypted messages explicitly detailed their final devastating move. Once I was quietly and permanently locked away in a highly secured private psychiatric facility under Dr. Vance's direct supervision, Julian planned to trigger an immediate fire sale acquisition. He was going to sell my entire life's work to our largest, most aggressive corporate rival for a mere fraction of its true market value. He would then quietly funnel the massive cash payout through a series of untraceable shell corporations to completely clear his $6 million gambling debt while paying Dr. Vance a handsome guaranteed $2 million consulting fee for his medical treason. They thought they had backed me into a corner, but they had absolutely no idea what I was capable of doing to survive. The walls of my own sanctuary had become a suffocating prison, but a warden must always know what happens in the cell blocks. Knowing that my son and my psychiatrist were actively conspiring against me was simply the outer layer of the rotten onion. I needed to see exactly how deep the infection ran within my own home. Over the course of 3 excruciatingly tense days, while Julian was out playing the carefree socialite or meeting with his underground bookies, I transformed my sprawling mansion into a fully functional surveillance fortress. I hired a discreet high-end security contractor who specialized in corporate espionage defense. Under the strict guise of upgrading my smart home system, they embedded microscopic audio recorders underneath the heavy oak dining table, behind the thick velvet curtains in the living room, and seamlessly integrated high-definition pinhole cameras directly into the ornate crystal chandeliers. The nerve center for this entire operation was a heavily encrypted server locked securely inside a false bottom of my heavy steel office safe. I now had eyes and ears in every single shadow of my estate. The revelation came on a Tuesday night. It was exactly 2 o'clock in the morning. Earlier that evening, I had put on a terrifyingly convincing performance of a woman completely losing her grip on reality. I had deliberately confused Julian, for my late father cried hysterically into my dinner napkin and eagerly chugged the tainted glass of milk he offered me before secretly spitting it into a hidden flask tucked into my sleeve. I dragged my feet up the grand sweeping staircase, heavily slurring my words, and locked myself in the master suite. Once safely inside, the sluggish, medicated demeanor instantly evaporated. I sat upright in the pitch dark, perfectly still, a single wireless earpiece pressed deeply into my right ear, monitoring the live audio feed from the downstairs living room. For exactly 2 hours, there was nothing but the steady, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock. Then the distinct clinking of ice cubes hitting a crystal tumbler echoed through my earpiece. Julian was awake. A few seconds later, the unmistakable sound of a dialed phone call pierced the silence. "It is done for tonight," Julian whispered aggressively into the receiver. His voice lacked any trace of the affectionate son. It was the harsh, strained tone of a desperate, cornered animal. "I doubled the dose exactly like you instructed. She is completely out cold, but we are running out of time here. The guys from the syndicate sent another physical threat to my apartment today. We need to accelerate the timeline, or I am a dead man." There was a brief pause as he listened to the voice on the other end of the line. "Do not give me that corporate patience garbage," Julian hissed violently. "I am the one doing the dirty work. I am the one risking a 20-year felony charge for poisoning my own mother. You just sit behind your massive glass desk, playing the supportive, worried partner. I need a guarantee that the moment she is committed, the executive board will instantly vote to liquidate." Another pause. My heart hammered against my rib cage, a cold sweat breaking out across the nape of my neck. Who was he talking to? Who had the executive power to guarantee a board vote? "Listen to me, Elias," Julian growled, dropping the name like a heavy iron anvil into the dead of night. "We agreed on a 50-50 split. You handle the corporate finances from the inside, Dr. Vance, and I create the medical liability from the outside. But if you try to screw me over and cut me out of my half of the settlement, I will drag you down to hell right alongside me." The audio feed cut out as Julian angrily ended the call, but I was no longer listening. The name echoed in the dark, empty chamber of my bedroom, bouncing off the walls and tearing through my flesh like jagged shrapnel. Elias. My brilliant, devastatingly handsome chief financial officer. The fiercely protective, endlessly charming man who had slipped a flawless 3-carat diamond ring onto my finger just 6 months ago. We were scheduled to be married in exactly 4 weeks in a lavish ceremony overlooking the ocean. The man I shared my bed with, the man who held the absolute most sensitive financial keys to Axiom Dynamics, was the mastermind quietly pulling the strings of my destruction. The sheer magnitude of the double betrayal threatened to crush my lungs. I was entirely surrounded. I was living and sleeping in a tightly coiled nest of venomous vipers. My son was the executioner. My trusted doctor was the architect of my madness. And my future husband was the quiet, smiling orchestrator directing the entire symphony of my demise. They had built a flawless trap, with Elias carefully manipulating the internal corporate ledgers to justify a rapid sale, and Julian holding the medical proxy over a supposedly insane mother. They were going to legally steal my entire life and leave me rotting in a padded cell. But they severely underestimated the monster they were trying to slay. I did not cry. I did not scream. The agonizing sting of heartbreak was instantly incinerated by a raging nuclear inferno of pure, unadulterated hatred. The venom they were pumping into my life became my fuel. If they wanted my money, I was going to ensure they choked on empty air. Starting at 3 o'clock that very morning, the hunted prey became the apex predator. I booted up my secure, untraceable terminal and began the most complex, aggressive financial restructuring of my entire career. I meticulously bypassed Elias and his compromised corporate network. Using a web of highly confidential international legal contacts, I started legally bleeding my own estate dry. I systematically liquidated my personal unattached equity and quietly funneled hundreds of millions of dollars into a complex maze of anonymous offshore blind trusts. I transferred the absolute legal ownership of my sprawling real estate portfolio, my private jets, and my massive offshore holding accounts to a series of phantom corporations registered in jurisdictions that refused to comply with domestic legal subpoenas. I did all of this utilizing highly encrypted blockchain ledgers and analog paper contracts executed by proxies, ensuring there was absolutely zero digital footprint left on my personal banking profiles. To Elias and Julian, the numbers on the internal corporate screens would still look perfectly normal, beautifully ripe for the taking. But those numbers were merely ghosts. I was silently hollowing out the empire from the inside, leaving them nothing but an intricate, beautiful, and utterly worthless shell. The trap was meticulously set, and the rats were completely oblivious to the poison I was preparing for them. I possessed more than enough concrete evidence to hand both of them over to the federal authorities right then and there. A single decisive phone call to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, handing over the irrefutable toxicology reports, the damning audio recordings from my living room, and the intricate financial trails would have ended everything. But putting them in cold steel handcuffs suddenly felt woefully inadequate. Prison was far too clean, far too structured, and entirely too merciful for the men who were actively trying to erase my existence. I wanted them to feel the agonizing, suffocating terror of losing their minds and everything they held dear. I wanted them to completely tear each other apart in the dark before I stepped into the light to deliver the final fatal blow. The justice system demands patience and due process, but my vengeance required absolute, unmitigated psychological destruction. The very first seed of destruction I planted was a brilliantly forged, highly convincing draft of my last will and testament. I meticulously crafted a formal legal document on my private attorney's distinctly embossed letterhead, copying the exact legal jargon used in my actual files. I deliberately left this explosive document sitting casually open on the massive oak desk in my private home office, precisely where I knew Elias and Julian would inevitably snoop while I pretended to be deeply asleep under the influence of their drugs. The newly fabricated clause I included was legally devastating. It explicitly stated that in the event of my mental incapacitation or medical incompetence, my entire vast estate, completely bypassing any standing corporate bylaws or familial inheritance rights, would be irrevocably donated to a global charitable foundation. There was only one seemingly impossible loophole left in the text. To inherit even a single dollar or retain their executive positions, Julian and Elias would be legally required to undergo a rigorous forensic financial audit by an independent federal agency. They would have to unequivocally prove absolute financial transparency and zero undisclosed personal or professional debts over the last 5 consecutive years. It was a brilliantly cruel trap. Julian had his massive $6 million underground gambling debt securely fastened around his neck, and Elias, as my private investigator had recently discovered, had been quietly embezzling minor corporate funds to fuel an illicit offshore account for his own luxurious habits. Neither man could ever survive a federal audit without instantly landing in federal prison. The very moment they read that forged document in the dead of night, absolute unadulterated panic set in. With the potent seed of financial terror firmly planted in their minds, I began the physical and mental dismantling of my own son. Julian was an absolute fanatic about his daily health regimen, proudly swallowing a large handful of expensive custom-blended vitamin supplements every single morning after his workout. It was ridiculously easy to breach the privacy of his suite. I systematically emptied his glossy, odorless capsules and meticulously refilled them with a precise, calculated cocktail of powerful, prescription-grade stimulants and a mild, highly disruptive hallucinogen I had discreetly acquired through my own shadowy security contacts. I was feeding him the exact same nightmare he had planned for me, only much faster and completely untethered from any medical supervision. Within 48 hours, the arrogant hunter rapidly devolved into the terrified hunted. I watched with a deep, dark, and almost sadistic satisfaction as the heavy, bruised circles under Julian's eyes grew darker and deeper with each passing day. His normally steady hands developed a constant, uncontrollable, and highly visible tremor. During our quiet family dinners, he would suddenly snap his head around, staring wildly into the empty, shadowy corners of the grand dining room, heavily plagued by the very same phantom noises and creeping shadows he had tried to inflict upon my brain. He could not sleep for days. He could not string a coherent sentence together. I would sit directly across from him, calmly sipping my pure, untouched mineral water, and offer him a sweet, deeply concerned, motherly smile. "Darling, you look absolutely terrible this evening." I would say, perfectly mirroring the fake, sickly sweet concern he had shown me just weeks ago at the restaurant. "You are sweating profusely, and your hands are shaking. Are you absolutely sure you are not working yourself too hard? Perhaps you really need to sit down with a psychiatrist." The sheer naked terror that violently flashed across his pale face was a delicious, intoxicating nectar to my wounded soul. He was rapidly losing his mind, trapped in a chemical prison of his own making, and he had absolutely no idea why or how it was happening. While Julian was violently spiraling into his chemical-induced madness, I focused my precision crosshairs on Elias. I utilized a heavily encrypted, entirely untraceable digital server located on another continent to send a series of cryptic, highly threatening anonymous emails directly to Elias's secure corporate inbox. The messages were surgically precise in their cruelty. They contained fragmented, heavily redacted screenshots of Julian's massive gambling debts and vague, terrifying hints that Julian was secretly cooperating with the Internal Revenue Service to save his own skin. I heavily and convincingly implied through the digital shadows that the desperate, increasingly paranoid kid was preparing to completely sell out his older, wealthier partner to the federal authorities in exchange for absolute criminal immunity and the entirety of the corporate payout. The once ironclad, arrogant alliance between the two traitors rapidly disintegrated into a toxic, highly volatile, and deeply paranoid nightmare. I watched them closely during our executive board meetings. Elias would sit at the head of the heavy mahogany table, glaring at Julian with pure, undisguised, murderous hatred, quietly terrified that the shaking boy was wearing a wire. Julian, constantly twitching and sweating under the heavy influence of my altered pills, would violently dart his eyes around the room like a trapped, frantic rat, absolutely convinced that Elias was plotting to have him killed to silence him. They were completely isolated, deeply terrified of the law, and now entirely terrified of each other. The grand explosive finale of this meticulously crafted psychological slaughterhouse was perfectly aligned with the most anticipated social event of our entire corporate calendar. We were rapidly approaching the massive, extravagant gala celebrating the 15-year anniversary of the founding of Axiom Dynamics. Exactly 300 of the most influential global investors, ruthless board members, and vicious financial journalists in the country were invited to the grand glittering ballroom of the city's most expensive, highly secured hotel. Through the hidden high-definition audio recorders scattered throughout my home, I listened with cold amusement as Elias and Julian finalized their desperately pathetic final plan. Driven absolutely mad by the impending terrifying threat of the fake will and their mutual suffocating paranoia, they mutually decided the gala was their absolute last, fleeting chance to execute the takeover. They planned to boldly slip a massive, highly incapacitating dose of the heavy narcotic directly into my vintage champagne, right before I was scheduled to deliver my live, televised keynote speech. Their ultimate goal was to make me publicly collapse into a raving, screaming, psychotic episode live on stage, giving the corrupt Dr. Vance the immediate, undeniable public justification he desperately needed to legally commit me to an asylum that very same night. They honestly and arrogantly believed they were setting the perfect, flawless stage for my grand public execution. They had absolutely no idea that I had already entirely rewritten the script, rigged all the heavy lighting, and firmly locked all the exits. The 15-year anniversary gala was absolutely not going to be the night of my tragic demise. It was going to be the most spectacular, devastating, and publicly humiliating bloodbath this city had ever witnessed. The grand ballroom of the St. Regis was transformed into a dazzling palace of crystal and gold, a fitting monument for the 15-year anniversary of Axiom Dynamics. Hundreds of the most influential people in the country were gathered under the soaring frescoed ceiling. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume imported orchids and the quiet electric hum of unimaginable wealth. Flashing camera bulbs from dozens of exclusive financial journalists illuminated the massive space, capturing the sheer opulence of the night. I made my entrance at exactly 8 o'clock in the evening, descending the grand sweeping staircase like a reigning monarch. I wore a custom-designed blood-red evening gown that draped over my figure like liquid fire. My hair was impeccably styled, my makeup flawless, and my posture radiated absolute, unshakable power. I smiled warmly at the sea of applauding guests, playing the perfect gracious host. But behind my radiant smile, my eyes were as sharp and unforgiving as razor blades. I knew exactly what was coming. I knew that somewhere in this glittering room, my fiancé and my son had prepared a special fatal toast, specifically designed to destroy my mind and steal my empire. I navigated the crowded floor with predatory grace, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries with board members and politicians. I kept my breathing steady and my mind entirely clear. Across the room, I spotted them. Elias looked incredibly dashing in his tailored tuxedo, but there was a rigid, unnatural stiffness to his posture. He was nursing a glass of scotch, his eyes constantly darting toward the main stage. And then there was Julian. My son looked like a walking corpse stuffed into a designer suit. The days of my relentless chemical gaslighting had completely eroded his nervous system. His skin was sallow, his eyes were bloodshot and wildly darting, and a thick sheen of cold sweat coated his forehead. He looked absolutely nothing like the confident young heir he was supposed to be. He looked exactly like a cornered, terrified addict. As the massive grandfather clock chimed to signal the beginning of the evening speeches, the trap was finally set into motion. Julian began making his way toward my center table, his hands trembling violently. He was carrying 2 pristine crystal champagne flutes. I knew instantly that the glass in his left hand, slightly tilted to avoid spilling, was heavily laced with a massive, mind-shattering dose of the hallucinogenic narcotic. This was their desperate final play. They wanted me to drink it right before I stepped onto the stage, ensuring a spectacularly public psychotic break. He approached me, forcing a stiff, agonizingly fake smile onto his sweating face. "Mother," Julian stammered, his voice cracking noticeably. "A toast. To 15 incredible years of Axiom Dynamics and to your brilliant leadership." Elias magically appeared at his side, holding his own fresh glass of champagne, nodding with artificial pride. "A beautiful sentiment, Julian," Elias added smoothly, though I could clearly see the tense, pulsing vein in his neck. "To the woman of the hour." They stood there waiting for me to take the poisoned glass from Julian's shaking hand. They thought they had cornered me. They were absolutely wrong. At that exact critical second, the heavy double doors of the kitchen swung wide open, and a sudden, sharp crash of shattered porcelain echoed loudly near the VIP seating area. A waiter had tripped, sending a massive tray of hors d'oeuvres flying. The entire room collectively gasped and turned their heads toward the commotion. It was a flawless, perfectly timed distraction, orchestrated by my new event manager. I had secretly hired Marcus, the former restaurant manager, who first showed me the security tape, and paid him an exorbitant sum of $50,000 to completely control the catering staff tonight. In the 2 seconds that Elias and Julian reflexively looked away toward the loud crash, my hands moved with the lightning speed of a seasoned street magician. I swiftly snatched the poisoned flute from Julian's left hand and seamlessly swapped it with Elias's glass, resting lightly on the edge of the high table. But I did not stop there. The glass Elias now held was not just my original harmless champagne. Earlier in the evening, I had personally spiked that specific glass with a brutal, fast-acting concoction of heavy pharmaceutical laxatives and a high-grade nerve stimulant. When they turned their heads back, the distraction over, I was holding my glass high, a picture of absolute serenity. "Thank you both so much," I said, loudly, ensuring the surrounding circle of powerful investors could hear my clear, affectionate tone. "But Julian, my darling son, you look completely exhausted tonight. I insist we share this beautiful moment equally." I stepped aggressively into his personal space, locking my eyes entirely onto his terrified, bloodshot pupils. I handed him the glass he had just brought me, the very same glass he had poisoned. "Drink with me, Julian," I commanded softly, but with a terrifying, unyielding iron grip in my voice. "Drink every single drop right now to prove your absolute devotion to your mother in front of all these wonderful people." Julian froze completely, his face drained of all remaining color, turning a sickening shade of ash gray. He stared down at the bubbling golden liquid, fully aware of the catastrophic dose of narcotics swirling inside it. He opened his mouth to protest, to make an excuse, but the piercing eyes of 50 major corporate shareholders and dozens of flashing cameras were suddenly locked entirely on him. He was trapped. If he refused the toast from his own mother at our company's biggest milestone, the social and professional humiliation would be instantaneous and catastrophic. His eyes darted frantically toward Elias, silently begging for an intervention, but Elias was completely oblivious, already raising his own swapped glass to his lips and taking a massive, greedy gulp. With a soft, pathetic whimper that only I could hear, Julian closed his eyes and downed the entire glass of poisoned champagne. I gracefully took a tiny sip of my clean drink and smiled warmly. Wonderful. Now, if you will excuse me, gentlemen, I must prepare for my speech. I gracefully glided away from them and took my seat at the head table, perfectly positioned to watch the magnificent destruction unfold. The biological countdown had officially begun. It took exactly 8 minutes. Elias was the first to fall. The incredibly potent mixture of the extreme nerve stimulant and the heavy laxative hit his system like a runaway freight train. I watched as he suddenly gasped, clutching his stomach. His impeccably styled hair was suddenly plastered to his forehead with a thick sheet of sweat. His eyes bulged wide with sheer, agonizing panic. The stimulant was sending his heart rate through the roof, causing his muscles to violently twitch and spasm, while his digestive tract completely rebelled. Unable to control the chemical storm raging inside his body, Elias completely lost his mind. He let out a bizarre, high-pitched shriek and blindly charged straight toward the main stage, violently shoving a highly respected state senator out of his way. Elias leaped onto the platform, frantically grabbed the main microphone from the podium, and began screaming absolute incoherent lunacy into the state-of-the-art sound system. "The numbers are completely fake," Elias roared at the top of his lungs, spit flying from his mouth, his face contorted in agony. "I cooked the books. I hid the money in the offshore accounts. The quarterly earnings are a total lie. The company is bleeding out and the IRS is coming for all of us." The entire ballroom plunged into a stunned, horrified silence. 300 jaws dropped simultaneously. The flashing of the journalists' cameras suddenly multiplied by 1,000, creating a blinding strobe light effect as they eagerly documented the chief financial officer of Axiom Dynamics publicly confessing to massive federal financial fraud while visibly convulsing on stage. But the horror show was only just beginning. As Elias collapsed behind the podium in a weeping, bodily soiled heap, the massive overdose of the hallucinogen finally seized total control of Julian's brain. He let out a guttural, terrifying roar that sounded like a wounded animal. Julian violently ripped off his expensive suit jacket, his eyes wide completely, unblinking, staring into a terrifying void that only he could see. The powerful narcotics had instantly shattered his grip on reality. In his chemically destroyed mind, the elegant ballroom had transformed into a deadly torture chamber, and the wealthy elderly shareholders surrounding him were the violent underground bookies coming to collect his $6 million gambling debt and break his legs. "Get away from me!" Julian screamed, backing away and frantically waving his arms at the invisible demons. "I will pay you! I swear I will pay you! Just do not kill me!" An elderly, highly respected board member reached out to try and calm him down. It was a fatal mistake. Julian shrieked in absolute terror, grabbed a heavy silver serving platter from a nearby table, and wildly swung it, smashing it violently into a towering ice sculpture. Shards of ice and silver flew everywhere. The luxurious anniversary gala instantly devolved into a chaotic, screaming riot. Guests were tripping over their expensive gowns, scrambling to get away from the violently hallucinating young man. Julian leaped over a dining table, kicking crystal glasses and expensive centerpieces into the air, blindly tackling one of our largest foreign investors to the ground, wildly punching at the man while screaming about loan sharks and blood money. Security guards rushed the floor from all directions, desperately trying to subdue the wildly thrashing, screaming heir to the Axiom empire. The journalists were absolutely ruthless, pushing forward their heavy cameras, recording every single second of the unimaginable corporate catastrophe. Through all the deafening screams, the breaking glass, and the absolute unmitigated destruction of the men who had tried to bury me, I remained seated in my plush velvet chair. I slowly crossed my legs, casually picked up my clean glass of champagne, and took a slow, deeply satisfying sip. I watched the violent, beautiful chaos unfold with an utterly cold, expressionless face. They had built a fire to burn me alive, and I had simply locked the doors and watched them immolate themselves. The trap had violently snapped shut, and the absolute destruction was a masterpiece. Right at the absolute zenith of the madness, as the shattered crystal crunched beneath the frantic feet of the city elite, the heavy mahogany double doors of the grand ballroom did not just open, they were violently kicked apart. A flood of dark windbreakers and tactical gear poured into the chaotic room. It was not the local precinct responding to a noise complaint. It was a fully coordinated raid by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, flanked by dozens of heavily armed city police officers. No one inside the hotel had called them. I had personally dispatched my private security team to deliver the undeniable mountain of physical and digital evidence to the federal prosecutor's office at exactly 3 o'clock that afternoon. The federal agents moved with ruthless efficiency, tackling Elias to the carpeted floor and pinning a wildly thrashing Julian against a marble pillar. The cold, unforgiving click of steel handcuffs echoed sharply, cutting straight through the lingering screams. The sudden, agonizing shock of the violent arrests seemed to forcefully snap their altered brain chemistry. The heavy, blinding fog of the narcotics began to rapidly recede, leaving behind nothing but the cold, terrifying clarity of their absolute ruin. Panting, bruised, and completely humiliated, both men slowly raised their heads. They looked up toward the grand podium. I was standing there perfectly still, my arms casually crossed over my chest. I looked down at them not as a grieving mother or a betrayed lover, but as a ruthless queen surveying the pathetic remains of a failed treason. The sea of shocked guests and frantic reporters instinctively parted as I slowly descended the plush velvet stairs, my high heels clicking ominously against the marble floor. I stopped exactly 2 feet away from my son. His chest heaved, tears of sheer panic streaming down his pale, sweat-drenched face. I reached into my small clutch, pulled out the silver flash drive containing the original restaurant security footage, along with the thick stack of his printed underground gambling debts, and threw them directly into his chest. They scattered across the floor at his feet. I leaned in close, letting the intoxicating scent of my expensive perfume mix with the foul stench of his profound fear. "Next time you plan a grand performance," I whispered softly into his ear, my voice devoid of any warmth, "remember not to leave your props behind." I turned my back on his sobbing form and confidently faced the blinding wall of camera flashes. The financial journalists were practically climbing over each other to catch my every word. I raised my hand, demanding absolute silence, and the enormous room instantly complied. "Tonight you have all witnessed the ugly, undeniable truth," I announced clearly, my voice projecting unwavering authority. I orchestrated this evening to publicly expose a despicable, highly coordinated conspiracy to violently seize control of Axiom Dynamics. The men you see in handcuffs attempted to poison my mind and steal my legacy to cover their own massive, illicit debts. I will always fiercely protect the core values and the financial integrity of this corporation, even if the enemies are sleeping under my own roof. The aftermath was entirely merciless and beautifully swift. Elias faced a brutal federal judge and received a heavy sentence of 15 years in a maximum security penitentiary for severe corporate embezzlement and wire fraud. Julian was entirely stripped of his trust fund and sentenced to 10 hard years for drug possession and conspiracy to commit grievous bodily harm. As for the esteemed Dr. Vance, his medical license was permanently revoked, and he was dragged out of his luxurious clinic in handcuffs to face his own lengthy prison sentence. A month later, the storm had completely passed. I sat entirely alone in my sprawling executive office on the absolute highest floor of the Axiom Tower. The city lights glittered beautifully through the floor-to-ceiling glass, a sprawling kingdom resting peacefully beneath my feet. I slowly poured myself a glass of pure, untainted vintage red wine. I raised the crystal goblet to the empty room, a genuine, completely unburdened smile finally gracing my lips. The absolute most dangerous enemies do not wait for you on the battlefield. They smile at you from across the dinner table. But I had thoroughly taken out the trash, and now I was finally free to enjoy my throne. Thank you all so genuinely much for tuning in and listening to my story today. I would absolutely love to know where in the world you are listening from, so please let me know in the comments below. If you found today's tale captivating, please consider helping us out with a donation of just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by using the PayPal link provided in the video description and the pinned comment. Your incredible generosity allows our channel to pay our hardworking staff so they can feed their families and continue creating even better stories to entertain you. Thank you again and stay safe.